Hello, everybody. Welcome to our first week of actual content. Now that I've gotten to, you know, be introduced to all of you, we're going to jump right in our short, semester that we have with each other. And we're going to spend our first week of content focusing on this larger question of revolutions in an age of revolutions, right? Because we are covering the title of the course is revolution in modern Europe and the Americas, and what exactly does that mean? We can also talk about it as an age of revolution. So we want to get a sense of what we consider to be revolutions and kind of take these broad definitions and see the ways in which they're excuse me, applicable to the past, and then also how we've come to understand this concept of an age of revolutions and why we want to analyze the revolutions in this way versus, say, solely focusing on the American Revolution or the French Revolution or the Haitian Revolution. So I'm going to give you a sense of laying that out for the first part of class, or the first part of this lecture, and then the last part will be some information about the first assignment that you're going to complete, and the assignments, generally speaking, that you'll have every couple weeks going to the end of the semester. One thing that I want to emphasize is when you watch these videos, it's a good idea to do a couple things each week to make sure that you're using your time the most efficiently that you can. So you want to make sure that you first look at whatever the discussion board post is for the week, and then you get a sense of what your reading should be geared towards. And then you should watch the video, because the video is going to help compile everything sort of together for you and think about it in a cohesive way. So when you get to the readings, of which there are sometimes a lot, or it feels maybe overwhelming or long, because I know this isn't the only class that you're taking, is you can really kind of focus in on the things that are going to be the most useful for you as you answer the discussion board post and as you think about whatever the final assignment is going to be asking you about, and you won't feel as as overwhelmed as you go through the material, because I definitely don't expect you to read all of these readings in depth, right? So keep that in mind as you go. Jumping in here to what we're talking about with revolution, right? If we looked at this from a political science perspective, then we could look at a term like revolution, and we could come up with a really strict definition of what we think a revolution is. And this is what I'm giving you here on this slide, right? This when a government is forcibly overthrown, right? When the government is no longer serving the needs of the people, and then you have a mass movement of peoples to overthrow that system. And then the sort of broad definition of this is there's social justice. Purposes behind this process of overthrowing, and some sort of end goal of equality, right? In a lot of the cases of what we'll be looking at for the purposes of um, this class. And then the end result, right, is we have a new political institution or institutions that are created in the end result of a revolution. In this political science sort of definition, right, we can think of all the things revolutions are not, which I've also listed here, right? They can be present within the process of a revolutionary effort, but if it doesn't have these components of an overthrow through mass mobilization in the name of some sort of form of social justice resulting in political institutions, then a political scientist would not consider it to be under the definition of revolution. So why are we talking about this sort of way of approaching it? Just to give us a sense of how we're choosing some of the revolutions that we're thinking about in this particular time period, and how other people tend to think about revolution. Since we're a history class, right, we are much more interested in the specific context that lead to revolution, and especially when we're talking about this idea of an age of revolutions, what all of these different revolutions in this period maybe have had in common. I think, as we'll see as we go through these next few weeks, some of these really broad definitions, social justice, new political institutions, mass mobilization, to what degree do we feel like they're happening in these different countries or regions is questionable, right? So again, really broad definition, helpful definition to make us think about revolution, but not necessarily something that's going to give us the full picture, right, of what's going on in each of these conflicts. there are also, right, in sort of trying to think about these really big questions, right? Like, why do revolutions happen? Why do they result in the end results that they tended to have? Then we also have these, like, sort of broader answers, which tend to be there isn't necessarily one, you know, key contextual factor, or even necessarily a combination of contextual factors that lead to revolution. That we can see throughout the course of human history, right? We're focusing on one specific time and regions that are all sort of impacted by um, imperialism and colonialism, right? So we can see some key historical factors in this particular time. But if we're taking it even, more broadly out into this idea of what revolution is, right, there isn't necessarily, we think most immediately about what we're going to cover first and probably what you know best, right? We don't have extreme amounts of poverty, for example, in the colonies, the American colonies leading up to the American Revolution, right? So there's got to be a lot of different factors that are essentially taking place underneath the surface, maybe more easily present or recognized by people at the time, or in our case, right, being people and scholars who are looking at this from a period in the present, things that maybe hadn't been as noticeable at the time, but we can now recognize as being very influential factors that lead to a level of discontent within the nation or region that would lead to revolution. So, our question, right, is if there isn't one key set of factors, is there a key set of factors? Are there certain contexts that are really clearly the reason behind why we have all of these different revolutions in what we would refer to as the Atlantic world, which is not in the title of our course, but essentially a really key component of understanding how we're looking at the revolutions in this class for for the entire course. So what's going on in what we refer to as the Atlantic world? This is also the period that we could refer to as the Age of Revolutions. I'll post this PowerPoint, so anytime I have links like I have in this slide, you can click on them if you want to. There's actually an entire website slash blog sort of dedicated to the idea of the Age of Revolutions, which if it's just something you're really interested in, you could take a look at. They cover a lot of the revolutions that we're covering in this class, and maybe some other revolutions besides that we don't necessarily have time for. But they cover all of these different sort of aspects. A bunch of scholars across the world really contribute to this website if you're interested in looking at it. But for us, right, we are focusing on the Age of Revolutions by essentially splitting it up into the different empires that are involved or impacted by revolutionary efforts. And this is helped guided for us by our main text for the semester, which is Wim Kloester's Revolutions in the Atlantic World. So our three empires, and the order in which we're focusing in on them, is going to be first the British Americas. We're going to focus on what we know best as the American Revolution, right? And that's what we will cover next week. But we will look at it from a slightly different angle than maybe we're typically used to. Then we will look at the French Americas, and we will look at two revolutions in the French Americas, the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution. And then finally, we will go to the Spanish Americas and look at a series of wars of independence in Latin America, right? So pretty much lines up with what's present in Klooster's book. What you want to think about as we go through and why we're starting on not really talking about a specific revolution at all is when we use the term Atlantic world, and what scholars are trying to achieve when we talk about the Atlantic world is this idea that we want to move away from a nationalistic sort of analysis of the past, right? We don't, if we only focus on America, right, and America's growth, it has benefits for us in understanding the historical sort of developments that lead to our present. So there's still value in looking at something from a national perspective, but we, by our nature, leave out all of the other contexts that play a role in, the evolution of the world, right? And so we, in terms of the last 30 years or so, really been an attention towards, and you'll get a sense of this in the readings, trying to focus in on certain um, encompassing themes or regions that are all impacted by similar changes to better understand all of the ways in which they are impacted and impacting each other in their developments, leading into our present sort of conditions, right? So, this is one of the um, more established arenas where that's the case. We look at the Atlantic world all being sort of impacted by imperialism, colonialism, the triangular trade system, slavery, right? All of these really kind of major moments in the history of the world and global connection, and really focusing in on their commonalities to better understand why these things happened and how they continue to impact us into the present. So, this is how we're focusing on this particular course, right? So, if you look at Klooster, and it depends on the version of the book you have, he talks about these things either way. But say you know somebody in this class, in real life, and you're talking about the book and you have two different versions, it is written slightly differently, but the end goal will essentially be the same. So it's fine if you have the older version of the book. There are some key things that Klooster is going to bring out, and some other things that I want to sort of emphasize here in terms of what he's going to establish in this first chapter that you're reading from him, the introductory chapter, right? If we're focusing on the Atlantic world and commonalities amongst all of these different empires, then one of the things that we have to focus in on, right, is how they're interacting with one another. So even though we won't, for example, cover the Dutch Americas, right, as an entire section within this course, the Dutch are really important in all of the things that are happening in this time period, because all of these empires are competing against one another for control, right? They're control and resources, and because there is a finite amount of resources, right? We're particularly interested in things like bullion, right? So if we are interested in all of these different empires by acquiring different resources and goods, by extension, you are negatively impacting the other empires that are competing against you, right? So you've got all of these empires that are competing against one another, involving themselves in each other's conflicts to kind of turn the tide, right, towards something that's going to benefit them. And so we look at things like we'll see next week, like French and Indian War, which is a much, much larger conflict, right, for all of these different empires than what we tend to focus on, which is essentially the colonial frontier, right? So that's one component that we have to think about, right? All of these empires competing against one another, all of the strains that it puts on these empires. And then from the internal sort of understanding, which Klooster will also talk about, this concept of privilege, right, is also really important in terms of understanding how people view themselves within the colonial enterprise, right? When we look at France, even, right, even in being in the mother country, right, what position you hold in this empire, right, is based off of these long-standing sort of beliefs about social hierarchy. So when we think about a term like privilege, right, it's not the same um, meaning as how we think about privilege in the present, it being a fairly loaded term for us today. So make sure you understand, right? Privilege is about this social hierarchy that exists within these European societies, which are later enacted in the colonies in a particularly unique way. Klooster will be very clear in each chapter about how these things play out in these individual situations that we'll be covering, right? But we've got this concept of hierarchy and this concept of privilege. And then when we get to the colonies and we have introduction of race, whether that's racial intermixing or it is slavery, right, then we have a further kind of evolution of this hierarchy within the system, which affects all of these different countries differently. The other component, when we're not talking about France, right, that we want to keep in mind when we're talking about the Atlantic world, is also because these are colonial enterprises, they are affected by indirect rule, right? So the degree to which an empire can enact strong control over the colonies is questionable, especially when they're engaging in all of these other conflicts around the world and they are in a significant amount of debt, right? And then they are struggling themselves in the mother country, right? So there's all of these questions about how effective is this rule? To what degree does this play a role in wanting to self rule, right? And to the degree in which you're comfortable with self rule under the control of another country, or you want to be completely independent from that country. So that's a big, right, sort of component when we're thinking about the Atlantic world and in the empire that exists at the time. When we're looking at what exactly the end results are going to be, this is the other thing that we're going to use Klooster for, right, is what's going on within the countries themselves when we're in the midst of revolution, in the midst of warfare, the systems that we are trying to overthrow, and to the degree that we think it is an overthrow of a system, is the entire order upended, because it is at its root, right, in many cases, a form of civil warfare, right? You are fighting against your own countrymen to overthrow the system. You have people who are revolutionaries, you have people who are loyalists, you have people who are not necessarily one way or the other. They tend to remain neutral, but you are fighting against, and we'll see this first off with the American Revolution, your family, your friends, right? All of these things are happening in the process of a revolution. And then the question at the end of it, right? This kind of overarching sort of idea of this creation of a new institutions in light of the overthrow of an older system is, do we end up with a democratic process at the end of the day? Is that really the end result? Klooster is going to be very clear on this point in the introduction when he says, no, right? There is not ultimately democracy taking place, but it tended to be an idea, right? And it's in our title of our course, right? This idea of liberty, right? And what liberty is, comparing this idea of liberty to democracy and to the degree that democracy actually happens, right? So these are the things that we want to pay attention to as we go through the following weeks. But for us today, right, we're focusing on this idea of the age of revolutions and where we get a term like this and why we're so fascinated with this idea. Hobsbawm will, coin this term for us. He is particularly interested in two types of revolution in his text, which I put the picture of here in the 1960s. He's talking about the French Revolution, and he's talking about the Industrial Revolution, and how these are two arms that lead us towards a period of modernity. And so this is kind of the origins of talking about questions of how we think about revolutions and the long-lasting effects of revolutions, all of these questions that I've kind of put here on the PowerPoint slide, right? How do we think about ourselves at the time? Do we consider ourselves even to be revolutionaries? What are we trying to achieve? Are we even trying to achieve something like democracy, right? All of these things that kind of open the door to the idea of thinking about revolution as its own sort of concept in which we can analyze many different historical actors. So this is the origins of thinking about this idea. As we go forward, we will think about how each of these revolutions fit into our larger questions about revolution and the age of revolutions. And this is going to lead me to ending us here on this focus on the assignments. So Module 1 assignment, all the assignments that are going to be due every few weeks are going to be written assignments, essay-based assignments. You don't need to do any outside research for any of the assignments that you'll do in the class, but we are going to continue to come back to key questions, and you'll use the sources that we have for each week to help you answer the questions that are being asked of you in each of this. It's basically an assignment for each module. People tend to ask, like, is it cumulative? Yes, because we are essentially building off of each new revolution that we are adding to our understanding of the age of revolutions. So you do want to keep in mind as we get to Module 3 assignment, and I'll talk to you more about it as we move through the course in these lectures. It is going to be a question about this concept of the age of revolution. So you want to make sure as we move on to Module 2, you don't forget all of the themes and all of the ideas that we've talked about in Module 1. There are these key things that will keep coming back to the discussion board posts. My lectures will emphasize these things as we move through the semester. So when we do Module 1 assignment, it's going to be only about the British Empire. You should be able to view it now, the questions that you need to answer, because everything in Module 1 is already available to you. When you do the assignment, and I'll talk more about it in the next week lecture once we're actually covering this particular revolution. You want to make sure that you are using sources, in text, citations, and a bibliography from the things that we are covering in the classroom. As you think about this going into our week about this particular topic. We are covering something that most of us are pretty familiar with, but we are putting it into a larger international conversation than what we typically do in an American history class. So the key things that you want to think about are the sorts of ideas that are being formulated at the time. Especially in an international context, right? Ideas about revolution, about liberty, about democracy, republicanism, all of these things that we associate with an American Revolution. Where are these ideas coming from? How are they making their way on the ground into the colonies, and really inspiring people to want to be part of this movement? And then how do we actually lead this to mass mobilization? How is it enacted on the ground? To what degree do we associate with the ideological components versus some of the other contextual factors? Like I said, we will talk about groups like the Dutch, right, being involved in this conflict for their own reasons that they see as beneficial to themselves. So on that note, I will leave us here. If you have any questions or concerns, inbox me on Canvas or email me, cvale@asu.edu. Otherwise, I hope you have a great rest of your week, and I will have you back again here next week to talk about the British Empire.